If you could live in any cosmic setting, where would it be? Now, a lot of sci-fi and space stuff tends to be pretty grim, and I'm looking at you, Warhammer. But what if you're looking for something that's not all doom and gloom? What if I told you that there's a world where space fantasy and absurdity are cranked up to 11? We're talking about giant space hamsters on exercise wheel-powered gnomish ships, British redcoat-esque hippo men, and interstellar vampires. D&D's Spelljammer is this wonderfully weird setting that some people describe as both the most awesome and also somehow the most ridiculous game ever made. It's a universe where anything you can imagine has probably been thrown in. Murderous asteroids, Lovecraftian horrors, and even other classic D&D settings like the Forgotten Realms. And if it hasn't been added yet, well, feel free to throw it in yourself. And it's a universe that just punches you in the face and simultaneously makes you feel like a kid again in the best way possible. Spelljammer is a wild mix of space opera, high fantasy, and pure unadulterated weirdness, but its journey has been anything but smooth. There's been drama and controversy galore, not least of which because of the relatively recent reboot by Wizards of the Coast. So in this video, we're going to dive into what makes this bizarre setting tick, its tumultuous history, and where everything's at today to explore whatever happened to Spelljammer. Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and welcome to Exits Examined. We will be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and an enormous shout out to my patrons who keep this channel alive. You guys rock. So how do you describe Spelljammer? Well, easy. It's D&D in space. And honestly, what more do you even need than that? Because if that alone isn't enough to launch your imagination into overdrive, I don't know what is. But if you want a little more flair, people have called it the deranged love child of Dungeons and Dragons and Star Trek, or Treasure Planet cranked up to 11. Or some just simply sum it up as a giant glorious WTF, and none of them are wrong. But if you're still not convinced, this is why you should care. Spelljammer is one of the most wildly imaginative, no-limit sandboxes ever made. Want some cosmic Lovecraftian horror? Sure. Space clowns? Absolutely. Giant space hamsters? Why not? Throw them in there. Alright, so let's take a step back and actually unpack this wonderfully quirky, chaotic setting. First things first, if you're thinking space equals science, take all of your hard sci-fi expectations and throw them out the window. Seriously, Spelljammer, yes, is in space, but it's all fantasy and all magic, which is a combination we don't get nearly enough of. Sure, spaceships and guns exist, but they're powered by magic. This is high fantasy in space, and that mix of ideas creates some really incredible possibilities that the original developers absolutely ran with. So what actually is Spelljammer, and what does it even mean? Well, like everything in the setting, even that can quickly get chaotic because the name itself pulls triple duty. It's A, the title of the setting, B, the name of a legendary one-of-a-kind spacefaring ship, and C, the verb referring to the act of spelljamming itself. And spelljamming, the verb I mean, is kind of the glue that ties together all the wild, sprawling concepts and ideas of this setting. So the act of spelljamming itself is pretty simple. It's essentially turning magical energy into propulsion for ships. The most common way to do this is using a spelljammer helm, which you can think of as a type of magical captain's chair that can look however wild or unique you want, which is fitting really because in Spelljammer, your ship is almost like its own character, and every ship in here is just incredible in its own way, and there's some wonderfully weird things going on, and the only limit is your imagination, and here are a few favorites. First up, you can pilot a giant space pyramid. Yes, a massive, magical funerary barge manned by servants who voluntarily follow their master into death by ritualistically killing themselves to power the thing as they take turns at the helm. Cheery, right? Or maybe you're more of a traditionalist, and you could go with a straight-up 17th century galleon. That's right, pretty much just a regular old ship, but in space. Then there's the legendary ship, the Spelljammer itself, which is kind of the holy grail of the setting. It's a sentient ship with a completely alien awareness and looks like an enormous manta ray with a city on its back that the ship itself kind of mind controls, and honestly, I could spend 30 minutes alone just talking about this one ship because it really does deserve it. But my personal favorite is probably the Titanic Dwarven Citadel ship, which is completely next level. Basically, picture a colossal rock in the shape of a giant dwarf face, bristling with heavy weapons like catapults and other medieval-style death machines carrying an entire clan of dwarves who are ready to blow anything out of space. It's just so over the top and ridiculous, I love it. And speaking of ship combat, this is a huge part of the setting. We're talking ballistas, cannons, and when all else fails, good old-fashioned boarding party. Now, you might be wondering, wait, how does shipboarding or a straight-up galleon even work in space? Which, to be fair, is an excellent question, and if it's somehow not clear to you by now, Spelljammer is basically one long to physics, but that's not to say it doesn't at least try to explain how all this is possible, and it does it in a very D&D way. Every ship basically has its own air and gravity envelope, so gravity in Spelljammer is very accommodating is probably the best way to put it, because it pulls from which way is, quote, that which is most convenient. So, for example, if you have an Earth-like planet, the pull would be from the center, or using the galleon I mentioned earlier as an example, gravity would be in a straight line through the center, so technically you could walk upside down on the bottom of the ship. As far as air, every person carries their own little bubble of air and gravity, which can run out. Now imagine all this wild gravity-defying shenanigans that could happen during a space battle. It's chaos, it's magic, especially when you add other ships in close proximity that may influence the gravitational pull of your own ship, and it's all just generally awesome stuff. Now, it's important to note that although these ships are racial and built by or for specific races, technically most races can pilot most of the ships with the correct know-how, because why wouldn't you want to see a GIF, who we'll get to in a second, and are basically giant hippo people at the helm of a giant space galleon? Now, you best believe that the races in Spelljammer are as varied, chaotic, and unhinged as the rest of the setting in the best possible way. Now, naturally, you've got your fantasy staples like humans, dwarves, and elves, but as with everything in the setting, these come with a twist. The elves, for example, have their usual superiority complex, because of course they do, but this time they've got a massive imperial navy to back up those claims of superiority. They're highly organized and control large portions of space, enforcing their rule with military precision. But it's really the unique races that make Spelljammer shine, and none are more beloved or gloriously ridiculous than the GIF. Imagine a 9-foot-tall humanoid hippo. Now dress it up like a British redcoat, complete with military regalia. They're a proud, loyal, and hilariously serious warrior race obsessed with uniforms, honors, and blowing things up with guns and cannons, and a fan favorite for good reason. I mean, redcoat space hippos, what's there not to love? But it's not all funs and games, because we also have the genuinely horrifying Yogi. These little horrors are a twisted combination of spider and eel flying around in death spider spaceships, which, yes, is a thing. They're a slaving race that pretty much views most other races as slave potential, and fun fact, when a Neogi grows too old, their own kind attack them with poison, triggering a grotesque transformation into a giant bloated monstrosity that eventually explodes, releasing a fresh batch of baby Neogi to continue the cycle. Delightful. Now, ever wondered where Baldur's Gate 3's nautiloid ships came from? That's right, the mind flayers were cruising the cosmos in Spelljammer long before, complete with their creepy tentacle head things. Then there are the beholders with their own terrifying ships, but not all are bad eggs. Most notably, we got Large Luigi, who is a beholder who settled down to become the proprietor, bartender, and bouncer of his tavern, the Happy Beholder, which is wholesome stuff, and I just love the idea of a bartender beholder. Now, because the universe-spanning nature of the setting, you technically could have almost any race in here, and we even got the Thry Queen from Dark Sun, those endearingly weird insect-like creatures who are obsessed with the hunt. But here's the kicker. Races in Spelljammer aren't static. They kind of rise and fall all the time. The orcs and goblinoid races, for example, were once a major force, but they were crushed by the elves in the Unhuman Wars. Now, the monsters of Spelljammer are just as weird and wonderful as everything else in the setting. Honestly, this roster might be one of the most chaotic collections of creatures in all of D&D, and it's glorious. Sure, everyone loves the iconic Spelljammer giant space hamster, and fair enough, it's a giant hamster in space, but that is just the tip of the iceberg. Let's start with the autognomes, who, to be fair, are not exactly a monster, but still, imagine a mechanical gnome made of gears, pulleys, and a dash of magic, and is a little clockwork construct that looks like something out of a steampunk fever dream. They're programmed with directives, and one of their primary commands is to defend babies and children from harm, which is sweet, right? Except the directive doesn't specify which species. So if an autognome sees an adult elf fighting a baby beholder, guess who's getting pummeled? But to be fair, I'm sure baby beholders are kind of cute in their own nightmarish way. Then there's the Albari, which is a magical space bird that is, quote, dedicated to the cause of chaos, which is pretty metal. But my personal favorite has to be the Murderoid, which is exactly what it sounds like, a murderous asteroid. Keep it simple, I guess. Now, you might be wondering, with all these insane space monstrosities, can we at least fire some cannons at them? Well, yes and no. Remember earlier when I mentioned cannons do exist, but they are rare? Well, there's good reason for that, and that is one of the most defining features of Spelljammer, the phlogiston. Also known as the Rainbow Ocean, the phlogiston is an endless sea of swirling, ever-shifting colors. Beautiful? Yes. Safe? Absolutely not. Not even close. Here's how it works. In the earlier editions of Spelljammer, every D&D world existed inside a massive crystal sphere, kind of like a giant cosmic D&D snow globe. Each sphere contains its own solar system with its own sun, but this is D&D, so not all suns are just big flaming balls. You could also have like 8 suns in there, whatever your fancy is. Anyway, let's take Kryn as an example, the world of Dragonlance. Its entire solar system floats inside a crystal sphere called, imaginatively, Kryn space, and the sphere itself drifts through the phlogiston, kind of like corks bobbing in an ocean, and over time they can move closer or further away from each other. Luckily, the rainbow rivers within the phlogiston stay relatively consistent, which makes navigation possible, and the density and speed of the phlogiston can vary quite a bit, so skilled pilots can use it to their advantage for faster travel, which is helpful, right? But there is a catch. It's highly flammable. I'm talking light a spark and everyone dies kind of flammable. So please, for the love of all that's good, no fireballs in the phlogiston, please. And this is the reason why ballista and other non-powder based weapons are much more common. And yes, I hear you, well actually guy in the back, the phlogiston changed a lot in later editions, and don't worry, we'll get to the 5e adjustments soon enough. Now, while the phlogiston is the space between the spheres, wild space is the void within each sphere, so the black nothingness of space that we're familiar with. And the spelljamming ships themselves sail these spaces, exploring, trading, and inevitably running into trouble. And the best part about this is that Spelljammer connects all the D&D worlds. Your party could be fresh off saving the Forgotten Realms, thinking they're hot stuff, and boom, suddenly they're in space on a colossus floating giant named Gump, who was kicked off his planet trying to catch his pet giant space worm, which is a real setup from one of the books, by the way. And in this way, the sense of scale in Spelljammer is just an amazing part of it. Sure, your party might be a big deal in Waterdeep, but in the universe, not so much. And on top of this, there are all types of hilariously creative ways to get your adventurers into orbit. From giant space balloons, sky ladders, you name it, it's there. But it is important to note, not every D&D world is accessible. Darksun and Ravenloft were completely cut off for both real-world logistical and in-universe reasons. So this delightfully absurd yet oddly beautiful description of the phlogiston and the Spelljammer universe opens the door to infinite possibilities, and just the sheer creative freedom it offers is pretty unparalleled. There's room for everything in here, and even a place called Doomspace, which is a D&D black hole-like realm, and when it comes to other worlds, the variety is truly glorious. Sure, you got your standard Earth-like planets, but that's really just the beginning. There are worlds made entirely of fire, endless air worlds where Cloud City dreams become reality, and if all that's too tame for you, how about a giant face world, a flat world, or just a giant tree solar system with each of the planets being like little fruit growing from the tree. And this is one of the best things about Spelljammer, because it pretty much just says to you, the player, you know what, go crazy. Want to build your own solar system or planet? Go for it. There's actually an entire system in place to design worlds of all shapes, sizes, and types. The framework is all there, just waiting for you to dream it up. And all the other world building in Spelljammer is just an absolute blast. One of the major hubs is a giant asteroid city bustling with life, and there are all these other hidden ports scattered across the different worlds, including even secret harbors near Waterdeep. Oh, and did I mention space vampires? Because yes, there are space vampires in the delightfully named Dark Space, which has its very own Ravenloft Strahd but on space steroids. And there's just all types of interesting and unique nooks and crannies in here, and with a really fleshed out map that more importantly leaves plenty of room for your imagination. There's Hero Space, home to a powerful fleet of spelljamming heroes, and Fairy Space with that giant tree solar system I mentioned earlier, where you could technically walk from one end of the system to another. There's also an interesting but often annoying twist for clerics, where if you leave your home crystal spear, you lose your connection to your god. And in the phlogiston, divine magic is cut off entirely, but don't worry, Spelljammer offers its own unique faiths, which do work in the phlogiston. Now, finally, we've got to talk about pirates, because space piracy is a massive part of the Spelljammer experience. Many of the setting's most memorable adventures revolve around daring heist, swashbuckling battles, and rogue crews navigating the wild, uncharted seas of the cosmos. And it's just a perfect fit for the setting because giant humanoid space hippo pirates is just an incredible concept. I don't care how old you are. Now, if all this talk of monsters and epic magic has got you thirsty and you want to drink out of something just as epic, I present to you Handy Goblin. Handy Goblin makes gorgeous handcrafted mugs straight out of a tabletop campaign. Made in Australia from high-quality stoneware, these mugs are tough, gorgeous, and unique. You got all types of fun fantasy designs in here that any nerd in your life will most likely be into, with my personal favorite being the good old Mimic mug. Now, it's clear the folks at Handy Goblin put a ton of love into making each and every one, right down to the packaging. They're perfect for treating yourself or as a gift for that special adventurer in your life who deserves something a bit special. So check out Handy Goblin in the link below and let me know which one's your favorite. So how did this all start? Well, let's go way back to the beginning, when Dungeons & Dragons first launched in 1974 under a company called TSR. The game was super barebones, with no pre-written adventures, and the idea was to leave everything up to the player's imagination, because why limit creativity with constraints? Let the dungeon masters have their fun. But throughout the 70s and 80s, TSR expanded rapidly, and adventures and settings became pretty popular, and TSR decided to cash in and pump out new products and campaigns at an almost unhinged pace. We're talking sometimes double-digit releases in a single year, and the result was a spectacular fall from grace, with Wizards of the Coast eventually swooping in to buy the company. Yet, in a strange way, we should be thankful for TSR's turbulent years, because it was in this time of relentless releases and experimentations that gave us some of D&D's most beloved settings like Planescape, Dark Sun, and of course Spelljammer. So how did such a wildly innovative and downright bizarre setting like Spelljammer come to life? Well, it almost didn't happen at all. The whole concept was the brainchild of Jeff Grubb, a longtime D&D designer, and his original pitch was simple: a fully armored knight standing on the deck of a ship in space. The idea was simple as it was ridiculous. Sword and sorcery adventures, but with outer space tropes. And by all accounts, he was having a tough time selling it. And interestingly, it could have taken a massive turn because none other than Zeb Cook, later known for his incredible work on Planescape, was almost given creative control. But eventually, Grubb took over, and in 1989, Spelljammer officially launched as a D&D campaign setting. Now, the influences behind it were as varied as its premise. Grubb drew inspiration from everything from classic sci-fi cartoons like Space Ghost to real-world scientific theories. The phlogiston, for example, was named after a real 17th century theory, and the concept of crystal spears enclosing entire worlds came from the art of the discoverers. But more than anything, Spelljammer was designed to break the mold of what D&D fantasy could be. Spelljammer launched in 1989 with the release of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in Space box set, which became the Bible of the setting. It had absolutely everything you needed: a detailed guide to space travel, iconic ships, and the wonderfully weird creatures. You also got a bunch of other gorgeous goodies like deck plans and massive color maps, and all of this was and still is a beautiful, ridiculous treasure trove of content. Now, from there, the line expanded with box sets like Legend of the Spelljammer, which explored the mythic living ship, the Spelljammer itself. Then there was the Astromundi cluster in 1993, which is a fan favorite that leaned into new race, new ships, and yes, space Vikings. Now, no D&D setting is complete without monsters, and Spelljammer delivered big. The Monstrous Compendiums from 1990 and 1991 introduced some of the weirdest, most delightfully bizarre creatures ever conceived, and special shout out to the Spider Asteroid, which is, you guessed it, a spider asteroid. Don't know how else to describe that one. So TSR was deep in its we need adventure for every setting phase at this time, so Spelljammer got a heap of them. We got Wild Space in 1990, which was the first and helped help parties actually launch into space. Skulls and crossbows brought space pirates into the mix, and crystal spears had the party stopping a space vampire from blocking out the sun, which Skyrim Dawnguard care to explain? We also got accessories detailing some of the specific spears. So for example, Kryn Space was exactly what it sounds like and looked at the solar system of Kryn. Another important one to mention is the Rock of Brawl, which is kind of the Mos Eisley hub of the setting where all manners of people and events could knot together. But all good things must come to an end, and by 1993 it looked like TSR was shifting focus, with Planescape set to kind of take Spelljammer's place in the market as the new world-spanning setting. And for a while it really looked like Spelljammer had sailed off into the cosmic sunset, and things did not look great when Wizards of the Coast acquired TSR and D&D in 1997. And they took one look at the mountain of bizarre settings, space hamsters, and flying ships and seemed to collectively say, yeah, we're good. And internally it really seemed like Spelljammer wasn't taken so seriously. But that didn't mean Spelljammer was completely gone. In 2005, Wizards gave a little love to one of its most infamous baddies, the Nyogi in the 3.5 edition Rules in Lords of Madness, complete with their cultural habits, stat blocks, and a map of a crashed spelljamming vessel. It was a small nod, but hey, we'll take it. Then came 4th edition, and Spelljammer made another cameo appearance in the Manual of Planes, but again, not that much, and it did seem like it was going to be the end, or was it? Now, for years and years, Spelljammer fans had one wish: bring it back. And the setting's return became something of a running joke in the community. Anytime Wizards of the Coast teased new content, you could count on someone shouting, "Is it Spelljammer?" And Wizards fueled the flame by sprinkling in little hints across other products, almost like they were testing the waters. And then in 2022, it finally happened. Wizards of the Coast took the plunge and released Spelljammer Adventures in Space for 5th edition. And the reaction? Well, calling it divisive would be a massive understatement. Now, the short version, because I love a good oversimplification, is that many longtime fans felt the 5e version was overly simplified and seriously lacking in world building. Each book was only 64 pages, which was far fewer than other settings got, and that left Spelljammer feeling really thin. Then the ship rules themselves felt extremely basic, and a lot of people felt let down. Gone were the detailed customization options from AD&D, no more tinkering with armor, swapping out weapons, or designing your own ships. Then there was just one type of spelljamming helm instead of the variety in 2E. And on top of all of this, the phlogiston was replaced by the Astral Sea, which really didn't sit well with a lot of purists. Essentially, it all kind of felt like a glossary rather than a fully fleshed out world, like there was no real flavor in the text. It also didn't help that 5e got in some hot water over the original printing, having what many thought of as pretty racist themes with the Hadozi species. Oh, and also fun fact, Wizards didn't consult Jeff Grubb, the original creator, while developing the 5e version, which he found amusing but not offensive, so at least there's that. That all being said, it wasn't all bad. The art is absolutely stunning, and the books were beautifully produced. The bestiary itself was solid, and the included adventures had some really fun moments. On top of that, the simplified ship combat wasn't necessarily a bad idea either for some players. Plus, we got some wild ship designs like a giant space tree, a scorpion ship, and even clown space pirates. In the end, 5e Spelljammer is fine, it's just not quite what some fans had hoped for, but it has to be said other fans have no problem with it and find 5e Spelljammer limitless. And I think this boils down to modern D&D design philosophies about player convenience, making the players feel powerful and cool. But this is in direct contradiction to classic D&D, which makes a lot of things inconvenient and directly challenging the players to adapt and make creative solutions. So I can see how there might be two audiences here. But like with all settings, all it takes is a little homebrew to make it come alive. And you can always make it your own that way, so at least we have that. But if all this 5e drama has you feeling a bit down and you miss the golden age of Spelljammer, don't worry, there's plenty of other Spelljammer goodness from the 90s, just in different formats. Back in the 90s, TSR published a 6-book series set in the Spelljammer universe, collectively known as the Cloakmaster Cycle. These novels were written by a handful of authors, including none other than Zeb Cook. Yes, that Planescape guy I mentioned earlier. The story follows Teldin Moore, a simple farmer from Kryn who comes into possession of a powerful magical cloak. Suddenly, he's thrust into the wild world of spacefaring adventures, complete with flying ships, alien threats, and more D&D goodness. Now, you don't need to be familiar with Spelljammer to enjoy it, and the series does stand well enough on its own, though it's certainly more rewarding for fans who want to dive deeper into the setting, and it really gave a sense of what it felt like to be in the Spelljammer setting and the factions within it. But believe it or not, these weren't the only Spelljammer stories to hit the shelves back in the 90s. Fascinatingly enough, and also a bit bizarrely, there were also Spelljammer comic books, 15 in total, that were released in 1990 by none other than DC Comics. Now, I have to admit, I was never able to track down a copy myself, and good luck finding one, either physical or digital, but from what I've heard, the series started off pretty strong, but ran into trouble with constant creative team changes, causing a rapid decline in quality. Now, if any of you out there have read these, I would love to hear your thoughts. And as one last other obscure branch of Spelljammer in the 90s, there was also Spelljammer trading cards, which if any of you have these laying around, hats off to you. Now, speaking of adaptations, you might assume that given TSR's track record with other settings like Dragonlance, Dark Sun, and even Ravenloft spanning a massive amount of video games, Spelljammer would get the same treatment. But I'm very sad to say that this was not the case, because we only ever got one Spelljammer Pirates of Realm Space in 1992. Now, it did promise space combat and sailing through the cosmos. Now, it did have its own charming retro space combat and first-person flight simulator where you could fire giant bolts from your ship's ballista. But of course, because of the technological limitations of the time, it was pretty limited. But it did have a really great soundtrack, actually. Also, fair warning, the game is pure, unfiltered 1990s difficulty, and it's not uncommon to get your entire party decimated pretty quickly. That being said, it's free to play online, so if you're feeling brave, why not give it a shot? Now, it wasn't until 2002 that we got another Spelljammer experience, this time from a team of freelance modders for Neverwinter Nights, because Neverwinter has everything. It was a mini adventure module which brought some Spelljammer ships, terrains, and creatures into the game. But honestly, for a setting this wild, a real video game adaptation, something triple or even double A, feels criminally overdue. With all of its outrageous physics, cosmic horrors, and delightfully chaotic nonsense, Spelljammer practically begs to be turned into an open-world space fantasy epic. Forget No Man's Sky, forget Starfield, I want Spelljammer. And who knows, with the massive success of Baldur's Gate 3, it's really possible we might get a wave of new D&D video games, and in the future, hopefully, Spelljammer might be one of them. So where does Spelljammer stand today? Well, after the mixed reception of the 5e release, things are a little uncertain. And as far as I could find, there hasn't been any news about any more official game supplements on the horizon, although it's definitely not outside the realm of possibility. And that all being said, it's not like the setting has been completely abandoned. As recently as 2024, a novel set in the Spelljammer universe called Memory's Wake came out, and it's actually an excellent read. It's a fun, tightly written adventure that serves as a great intro to the setting, while also standing on its own, and seriously, I had a blast with it. And even on the video game front, fans haven't been sitting still. There are mods galore, with Baldur's Gate 3 getting some Spelljammer-inspired content, plus an endless wave of Neverwinter Nights mods that keep the spirit of the setting alive. And despite the rocky launch of 5e Spelljammer, the fandom is as dedicated as ever. It's constantly on the list of people's favorite D&D settings, and creativity on display is wild. Fans are crafting everything from detailed ship models to expansive maps and jaw-dropping fan art. And if you just browse the Spelljammer Reddit, you'll quickly see what I mean. So the question is, why? What makes Spelljammer so endearing? Well, like with many things in life, it's probably a combination of things. First of all, I don't mean to beat you over the head with this, but it really is an incredible sandbox. Anything is possible here. You could dive into some dark and gritty themes, or you could go completely wild, exploring entirely new universes. Or the beauty is, you can do both within the same campaign. There are no limits. Then there's the joy of uncovering hidden parts of the campaign worlds. Spelljammer is full of these endless cool little details. Planets, moons, stars, and it's that sense of wonder that keeps you going and going. And finally, let's not forget, I think there's something about being the outsider or the drifter that resonates with a lot of players. A lot of D&D players, especially in the early days before fantasy and nerd culture was almost in vogue like it is now, were kind of misfits, and Spelljammer gives you the perfect space to explore that and also reclaim it, almost as a strength, if that makes sense. After all, everyone's an outsider in space, and your crew could be a motley assortment of musket-wielding hippos, talking goo, or anything else, and the difference between all of you doesn't seem that different at all when you're on the back of a colossus space giant running for your life from killer space hamsters. And just the fact that Spelljammer can even put you in such a wonderfully weird and absurdly chaotic scenario is truly a thing of beauty, and another reason why Spelljammer continues to endure. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the help and support. I want to give a gigantic shout out to Nick Lucas, aka DM Jack, for helping me fact check. Also, another shout out to Peter H. or DM Resner, also for helping me fact check. Finally, I want to give a huge special shout out to Indie Hawk, who helped me tremendously with fact checking and bouncing ideas off of. No shout out is ever complete without shouting out my incredible patrons who literally keep this channel alive. I cannot thank you guys enough. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check my Patreon link in the description below, and you can contribute for as little as $1 a month. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. I've learned about some really cool series thanks to you guys. Anyway, thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.